They landed in darkness and uncertainty on August 7, 1942, believing they were seizing an unfinished airstrip that would give the United States its first foothold in the Pacific and allow them to stop Japan's southward advance. What the Marines did not yet understand was that Henderson Field, the half-built runway they captured almost without a fight, was about to become the most contested patch of ground in the Pacific War. For the first 24 hours, Guadalcanal felt almost empty. The Japanese construction crews fled into the jungle, leaving behind machinery, fuel drums, and bulldozers still warm from use. The Marines dug in quickly, uneasy but unaware of the storm coming for them. They had successfully achieved strategic surprise. What they could not know was that Japan considered the loss of this airfield unacceptable. Within hours of the landing, Japanese naval bombers from Rabaul struck the beachhead. And that night, the Imperial Navy delivered its first shock. The Battle of Savo Island, where 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in a matter of minutes. The U.S. Navy, stunned by the ferocity of Japanese night fighting, withdrew under threat of further losses. By dawn on August 9, the Marines realized the unthinkable had happened. They were alone. Their ammunition, food, medical supplies, and aviation fuel had been unloaded in chaotic haste before the transports fled. Much of it was scattered across the beach or lost at sea. The Marines suddenly found themselves defending an island with no guarantee of resupply and no certainty the Navy would return. Guadalcanal had begun as an offensive. Overnight, it became a siege. The Japanese moved quickly to retake the airfield. They sent light infantry units through the jungle to probe the marine perimeter. They sent warships down the narrow channel the Americans soon called Iron Bottom Sound to shell Henderson Field almost every night. And they sent high-performance Zero fighters and bombers from Rabaul to smash anything the Marines tried to build. The airfield became both lifeline and target. Whatever aircraft the Marines could get into the air, F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, even a handful of Army P-400s, formed what would soon be known as the Cactus Air Force. But in the first days, it was barely an air force at all. Planes landed on a strip so rough, pilots compared it to landing on marbles. They operated with minimal fuel, few spare parts, and under constant threat of bombardment. Marines worked with shovels and bare hands to repair craters each morning before the Zeros returned. Meanwhile, the Japanese escalated their attempts to retake the island. On August 21, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's regiment launched a frontal assault on the Marine lines at the Ilu River, known to Americans as the Battle of the Tenaru. Wave after wave of Japanese infantry charged straight into Marine machine guns and 75mm pack howitzers firing over open sights. The Marines won decisively, but the message was clear. Japan was prepared to sacrifice entire regiments for Henderson Field. By September, Japanese commanders began coordinating their attacks with naval bombardments and air raids. Each night, heavy cruisers and battleships pounded Henderson with shells. Each morning, repairs began anew. Each afternoon, bombers roared in from Rabaul. The Marines were exhausted, short on sleep, and burning through ammunition faster than it could be replaced. Worse still, with the Navy gone, the Marines had no idea when or if more supplies would come. The isolation grew more severe with every passing day. Patrols sent into the jungle reported Japanese troops approaching in ever larger formations. The 1st Marine Division had landed expecting a quick strike. Instead, they were digging trenches, rationing food, and defending an airfield that the Japanese were determined to erase. Henderson Field was not just a runway, it was the fulcrum of the campaign. If the Americans could keep aircraft flying, they controlled the daylight skies and could interdict Japanese convoys. If they lost the airfield, they lost the island. And for the first 6 weeks, they came dangerously close to losing it. Every bomb crater, every night bombardment, every attack from the surrounding jungle chipped away at their ability to defend it. The Marines held on through grit and desperation. But as September ended, it became clear that Henderson Field's survival no longer depended only on the men on the island. It depended on whether the U.S. Navy, Badly battered, shaken by night-fighting defeats, and fearful of Japanese superiority after Savo Island, would return to fight for Guadalcanal. If it did not, the defenders knew the truth. The Japanese would come in force, and no amount of courage would keep the airfield in American hands. By late August 1942, the Marines defending Guadalcanal had learned a grim routine: survive the night, repair the airfield at dawn, brace for air raids at noon, and wait for the jungle to come alive after sunset. Henderson Field was never safe, not for a single hour. Every day, the Cactus Air Force struggled to launch the few aircraft still flyable. Every night, the Japanese attempted to wipe both airfield and defenders off the map. The siege had begun. The Japanese High Command underestimated the American landing at first, assuming it was a probing action. When the scale of the Marine presence became clear, they began pouring in troops from Rabaul and the Shortlands, even if they had to send them in small detachments aboard destroyers and barges. This improvised supply line earned the nickname Tokyo Express, and each night its destroyers raced down the slot to bombard Marine positions before unloading fresh infantry east of the airfield. The first major attack came at the Tenaru on August 21. Colonel Ichiki's elite detachment believed they could overrun the Marines in one swift bayonet charge. Instead, they rushed into interlocking fields of fire, were cut down by machine guns, and were pummeled by 37mm canister and 75mm pack howitzers firing point blank. It was a brutal American victory, yet it carried a foreboding truth. The Japanese were willing to sacrifice entire units to retake the airfield, and more troops were coming. September was worse. The Japanese assembled a full regiment under General Kyoto Kake Kawaguchi and attacked the high ground south of the airfield, Edson's Ridge, the key to Henderson's survival. Under fog and jungle darkness, Kawaguchi's men assaulted the ridge again and again on the nights of September 12 to 14. The Marines, paratroopers, raiders, and riflemen mixed together, fought through near breakthroughs that came within yards of collapsing the entire perimeter. Major Kenneth Bailey fell leading a countercharge. Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson moved his command post 3 times under fire, rallying shattered units. Some sections of the ridge changed hands more than once. By dawn, the hillside was littered with Japanese dead, over 500 killed, but the Marines were shaken to the core. They had won, but barely. Henderson Field remained in American hands, but its defenders were exhausted and bleeding. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy made sure the Marines paid for every hour of daylight. Cruisers like Kumano, Suzuya, Aoba, and Furutaka prowled Iron Bottom Sound, bombarding the airfield with hundreds of shells. On multiple nights, Japanese battleships fired 14-inch salvos, transforming Henderson into a wasteland of cratered earth and burning wreckage. One Marine described the bombardment as being inside a metal drum while someone hit it with sledgehammers from every side. Each morning, Marines and Navy Seabees worked frantically to fill shell holes with crushed coral so the Cactus Air Force could get even a handful of aircraft back into the sky. Yet those aircraft were indispensable. Without them, Japanese transports would reach the island unmolested and land thousands of reinforcements. With them, the Marines kept the initiative, barely. Every Wildcat and Dauntless mattered. Every gallon of aviation fuel mattered. Every repair that kept a single engine running mattered. But the attrition was severe. During the Matanikau actions in late September and early October, Japanese forces repeatedly tried to push west around the Marine perimeter. Each confrontation drained American ammunition, manpower, and strength. By early October, the Marines were holding a defensive loop barely 8 miles long, surrounded by a jungle full of enemies they could hear but rarely see. Malaria swept through the ranks. Rations ran low. Defensive works thinned as fatigue set in. The perimeter was shrinking, not physically, but psychologically. Marines started calling themselves the Orphans of the Pacific. Letters home carried a common refrain: no one knows when, if ever, the Navy is coming back. And every night the Tokyo Express arrived, bringing more shells, more troops, more pressure. Some nights, Japanese soldiers probed the wires so closely that Marines could hear them speaking. Other nights, flares rose over the jungle as the Japanese prepared for another assault. The Americans lived in a constant state of expectation. Every rustle, every insect hum, every shift in the dark might signal the beginning of the next attack. By October, Henderson Field was hanging by threads of coral, sweat, and stubborn resolve. The Marines had survived the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge, but they were no closer to securing the island. In fact, the siege tightened with each passing day. The Japanese were not losing momentum, they were gathering strength for the decisive blow. And unless something changed, unless the U.S. Navy returned, the defenders knew that the next major assault might be the one they could not stop. By October 1942, the Marines on Guadalcanal understood that Henderson Field was less an airbase and more a miracle stitched together from broken aircraft, scavenged parts, and sheer human endurance. The men who flew from its cratered runway called themselves the Cactus Air Force, and though the name carried a hint of swagger, the reality was far harsher. Cactus was an air force in name only, an improvised, undersupplied collection of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and exhausted pilots holding the line against a superior enemy because no one else could. Supplies were the first crisis. Fuel arrived in 50-gallon drums rolled off overloaded transports during the rare moments the U.S. Navy dared approach the island. Sometimes the drums were punctured by shrapnel before they even reached the airfield. Sometimes the Japanese bombers ignited them before they were even unloaded. Aviation gasoline, 100-octane lifeblood, was rationed so tightly that pilots were told to limit warm-up time to seconds, not minutes. There were days when Henderson Field had only enough fuel for 2, maybe 3 full missions. Mechanics became scavengers. The Cactus Air Force was famous for keeping unflyable aircraft in the sky, but the truth was grimmer. They cannibalized wrecks because there was no other choice. A Wildcat landing too hard was not written off. It was stripped clean of usable parts. A Dauntless with a damaged wing became a donor aircraft for 3 others. Even the precious few TBF Avenger torpedo bombers were held together with improvised repairs of wire, dented sheet metal, and hand-carved wooden blocks. Spare engines were so rare that one pilot joked, "If you want a new motor, you better pray the Japanese drop one." And then there were the pilots themselves. Fatigue became a constant companion. The Cactus Air Force flew missions at dawn, intercepts at midday, close support in the afternoon, and emergency sorties whenever Zero fighters appeared over the horizon. They slept in half-hour bursts under mosquito netting riddled with holes. Many were sick, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, but flew anyway because there was no one to replace them. Some pilots logged over 20 combat missions in a single week. Others collapsed from exhaustion on the wing of their planes after landing. The grinding routine showed in casualty numbers. In the skies over Guadalcanal, a pilot's life expectancy in certain squadrons was measured not in months but in weeks. Yet, despite the losses, despite the wreckage, the shortages, and the fatigue, the Cactus Air Force had one irreplaceable advantage: the airfield itself. If Henderson Field survived, American forces could strike Japanese shipping, cripple reinforcements, and maintain daylight air superiority. If Henderson fell, the Japanese could turn the entire Solomon chain into a fortress. That knowledge weighed on every pilot who climbed into a cockpit missing panels, instruments, or armor plate. And the Japanese knew it too. Their entire strategy in the autumn of 1942 was focused on crushing the Cactus Air Force before it could recover. Bombers from Rabaul attacked daily. When cloud cover protected the airfield, the Japanese Navy shelled it at night. During the October bombardments, battleships Congo and Haruna swept Iron Bottom Sound and unleashed over 900 16- and 14-inch shells onto the airfield, leaving it cratered and burning. Several planes were destroyed on the ground. Maintenance tents vanished in fireballs. For a moment, it seemed that the airfield might be rendered unusable. But at dawn, the Marines and Seabees were already at work filling craters, dragging wreckage aside, and pouring crushed coral into the most damaged sections. By midday, the surviving Wildcats were airborne again. The Japanese pilots, seeing aircraft still rising from the smoke, reportedly asked how such an airfield could possibly still function. The answer was simple: it had to. Yet the margin for survival grew thinner every week. The Cactus Air Force often had fewer than a dozen operational fighters. Dive bombers dwindled to single digits. Several days passed in October when no long-range scouting plane could fly, leaving the Marines blind to incoming attacks. Losses among pilots meant inexperienced replacements were rushed into combat with barely a handful of training hours in their new aircraft. Some learned to operate a Wildcat's complex landing gear system only hours before their first combat sorties. Despite all this, Henderson Field endured. But the defenders knew the truth. They were at the breaking point. One more week of bombardment, one more major Japanese ground offensive, or one more failure of supply could doom them. The Japanese sensed it too and prepared their strongest assault yet. And far away at sea, the battered U.S. Navy faced a decision that would shape the fate of the entire Pacific War: whether to return to Guadalcanal and fight again, or leave Henderson Field to fall. By late October 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal had deteriorated so severely that even senior American commanders feared the island might be lost. Henderson Field was barely functioning. The Cactus Air Force was flying on scavenged parts and fumes. The Marine perimeter had thinned to the point where gaps were held by scattered riflemen and hastily emplaced machine gun nests. And each night, the Tokyo Express delivered more Japanese troops who gathered in the jungle for the inevitable decisive assault. The Marines could hold, but only if the U.S. Navy returned. That prospect was far from certain. After the staggering losses at the battles of Savo Island and the Eastern Solomons, and then the brutal attrition at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in late October, the Navy had only one operational fleet carrier left in the entire Pacific: USS Enterprise, CV-6. The Big E, already legendary, was battered, her flight deck damaged, her elevators strained, her crew exhausted. But she was still afloat, still fighting, and still the only ship capable of providing the air cover Henderson Field so desperately needed. Despite the risks, the Navy made its decision. Enterprise would return, and she sailed not alone. Battleship USS South Dakota, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels accompanied her, forming a task force ready to challenge the Japanese Navy in the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Their arrival changed everything. At sea, the Japanese prepared their own decisive blow. Admiral Nobutake Kondo assembled battleships, cruisers, and destroyers for a massive bombardment aimed at leveling Henderson Field once and for all. On land, General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army prepared its largest ground assault to date, believing the airfield would soon be neutralized by naval gunfire. Japan intended to crush the Marines and retake the island in one synchronized strike, sea, air, and land converging. What followed were the naval battles of Guadalcanal, a series of desperate night engagements between November 12 and November 15. On the night of November 12-13, an American cruiser-destroyer group under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan met a far superior Japanese force in what became one of the closest-range surface battles of the war. The fighting was chaotic and savage. Ships exchanged fire at point-blank range. Radars malfunctioned or were ignored. Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott were both killed. American cruisers Atlanta, Juneau, and Cushing were lost. But the Japanese bombardment mission failed. Their battleships were forced to withdraw before destroying Henderson Field. The next night, on November 14, Enterprise launched strike after strike against Japanese transports and covering cruisers. Though her air group was depleted, every pilot knew the stakes. They attacked relentlessly, sinking transports and damaging Japanese vessels before they could reach the island. Henderson Field's surviving planes joined them, turning the waters north of Guadalcanal into a graveyard of burning ships. On the night of November 14-15 came the climactic battle. The battleship USS Washington, accompanied by South Dakota and a screen of destroyers, intercepted a Japanese task force centered around the battleship Kirishima. In a duel illuminated only by star shells and radar screens, Washington's 16-inch guns pounded Kirishima into a flaming wreck. The Japanese withdrew. Their last, best chance to annihilate Henderson Field had been shattered. And throughout these brutal nights, the aircraft of USS Enterprise operated whenever conditions allowed. striking enemy ships, spotting movements, and providing the thin layer of air cover the Marines desperately needed. For the first time since August, the Marines heard a sound they had begun to believe they would never hear again: the steady, confident rumble of American carrier aircraft overhead. The psychological impact was immense. Even more important was the material effect. With the Japanese Navy driven back, American transports poured supplies onto the island: food, ammunition, artillery shells, aviation gasoline, medical supplies, and most critically, replacement aircraft and pilots. Henderson Field surged back to life. Wildcats taxied with full tanks. Dauntless dive bombers returned to medium-altitude patrols. Avenger torpedo bombers resumed anti-shipping strikes. The Cactus Air Force, once on the brink of collapse, could now fight again. Japan had bet everything on retaking the airfield before the U.S. Navy intervened. They failed. And in that failure lay the beginning of Japanese defeat in the entire Solomon Islands campaign. Henderson Field still stood, scarred, cratered, barely functional, but alive. And because it lived, Guadalcanal remained in American hands. By late November 1942, the transformation on Guadalcanal was unmistakable. The Marines, who had once fought with rationed ammunition and failing morale, were suddenly receiving crates of fresh supplies. The Cactus Air Force, previously down to a handful of flyable aircraft, now saw new Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and Avengers rolling off transports and roaring down a runway that only weeks earlier had seemed doomed. And beyond the horizon, the gray silhouette of USS Enterprise still patrolled the waters of the slot, a constant reminder that, for the first time since August, the United States Navy truly controlled the sea lanes supporting Guadalcanal. Japan sensed the shift too. Their ground forces, exhausted and ravaged by disease, had suffered catastrophic losses in the failed October offensive and the November battles. Their supply lines, relentlessly attacked by Cactus Air Force sorties, were collapsing. The once feared Tokyo Express could land only small detachments, usually forced to abandon ammunition and heavy equipment in order to evacuate their own wounded. The Japanese 17th Army, which had marched into the jungle with confidence, now faced starvation. Some units resorted to eating roots and tree bark. Others attempted attacks with only grenades and bayonets because they lacked rifle ammunition. And still, Tokyo insisted the island must be retaken. But the November naval battles had broken the back of Japan's ability to project power into the southern Solomons. The loss of Kirishima, the crippling of cruisers, and the sinking of transport after transport meant Japan could no longer deliver troops in meaningful strength. For every Japanese battalion attempting to reach the island, 2 were destroyed aboard burning transports or drowned in the waters that Americans would forever call Iron Bottom Sound. Henderson Field, once a symbol of desperation, had become a fortress. Every morning the Cactus Air Force lifted off to strike Japanese positions, interdict supply runs, or patrol the surrounding seas. The Marines expanded their perimeter, pushing Japanese forces farther from the airfield and reducing their ability to mount coordinated attacks. With fresh Army units arriving, most notably the Americal Division and the 25th Infantry Division, the exhausted Marines finally had the manpower to rotate out of the most decimated positions. New artillery batteries rolled ashore. New medical teams treated the hundreds weakened by malaria and dysentery. For the first time since August, the Americans were no longer fighting from behind. They were dictating the pace of the campaign. In December and January, the initiative shifted completely. U.S. offensives at Mount Austin, the Gifu Strongpoint, and Galloping Horse shattered the last organized Japanese defenses west of the Matanikau. Each ridgeline cost blood, but the result was clear. Japan no longer had the strength to contest the island. Ironically, the Japanese High Command came to the same conclusion long before they admitted it publicly. By December 1942, they knew Guadalcanal had become a death vortex, one draining their best troops, their shipping capacity, their limited oil reserves, and their irreplaceable naval air crews. But pride and political fear kept Tokyo silent, while thousands more men were sent into a campaign already lost. In January 1943, under the codename Operation K, Japan finally accepted reality. Under cover of darkness and foul weather, the Tokyo Express shifted from delivering troops to evacuating them. Across several nights in early February, destroyers slipped along the coast, retrieving the survivors of the 17th Army, gaunt, sick, and starving. When the last destroyer fled northward on February 7th, the Battle of Guadalcanal was over. America had won. But victory came with the sobering knowledge that how close defeat had been. Had the Cactus Air Force collapsed in October, had the Japanese battleships succeeded in leveling Henderson Field, had USS Enterprise not returned to the fight, any of these might have doomed the campaign. Guadalcanal was not a triumph of overwhelming strength. It was a triumph of endurance, improvisation, and a Navy and Marine Corps refusing to abandon each other in the darkest moments of the Pacific War. Henderson Field remained in American hands, and because it did, Japan's expansion southward was halted forever. The Solomons would fall next, then the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Guadalcanal did not end the war, but it ended Japan's ability to win it. The island that America nearly lost became the place where the tide finally turned.